This is Paths of Glory. Here we have the deluxe edition from GMT Games. I want to start with the map zoomed out to show you the scope of the game. This is Europe set in World War One, and we'll say more about the map later, but give you a sense for how broad the game is. We have a Near East map over here with Turkey and Arabia, Persia, etc. But let me go down the table and show you combat units, which are really part of the key of this game. Here we have some Allied units on the top row, and on the bottom are some Central Powers units. You see Britain, France, and Russia there, and then Germany, Austria, Hungary on the bottom. Now, the top bigger chits are armies, and the smaller, lower chits are corps. And the numbers left to right mean combat factor, loss factor, and movement factor. And higher is better in each case. So combat factor is your strength in battle. Loss factor is how much damage you can absorb in battle before being reduced or flipped. And movement factor is how many points on the map you may move when you activate for movement. And on the map, the movement is simply point to point. It's very elegant and fluid. You see some terrain effects, like you see some mountains here in this region. Elsewhere on the board, you have swamps and forests. Forests are the green there in Sedan. Calais is a swamp, as is Ostend. Those only have effects in combat, and I won't cover those in this video, but movement is simply point to point. So these units here, most can move 3 spaces, some of the corps can move 4. Now, when you take damage in combat that's equal to or greater than your loss factor, you have to flip your unit to the reduced side, and I have some of those down here to show you. In most cases, at least one number goes down, though not always. You'll see the French corps has the same numbers in its full strength state as well as its reduced state. Now, if a reduced state unit takes damage equal to or more than its loss factor, it is eliminated. And armies are replaced by corps from the reserve box, if there are any in the reserve box, and you start with some. And corps that are reduced and eliminated are put in the eliminated box, which each player has one. Here's the Allies right there. CPs is up top over there. And so, well, how does combat work? Let me show you a simple example of the way combat can happen. So here we have a German army that could attack the French army in Florence. So the German combat factor is 5 against the French of 3. And so you would take those numbers to the CRT, the combat results table for the game. And corps, if a corps is firing without an army, it fires only on the corps table. If an army is firing, obviously you're on this table here, but also if an army has a corps, for example, here in Rome, we have a 2 and a 1, so that combined units would be firing on the army 3 table. And so when you make an attack, both players roll, and you find your result, and that's the number of damage you're dealing out to the opponent. And all damage must be resolved through, again, flipping and replacing units as required. And that's a simple example of how combat could work. And so, those are a bit about the units, and I want to take you now over to the cards, because the cards really do drive this game. It's the heart and soul of this game. So here is the opening standard move for the Central Powers player, a card called the Guns of August. You see a lot of info on this card. It's got 2 numbers up top, an event, a number by the event, and numbers on the bottom next to certain nationalities. So these cards each have 4 uses, and I'll cover them in order. So the biggest number up top to the left of the slash is operations value. And if you're familiar with CDGs at all, you know operations is how you move and attack on the map. And so this card will give you 3 points of operations to use on the map. Now you can use ops to move or attack. You activate a space for either of those, but not both. So here, Italy could be activated to move one or both of those troops down to Naples. You cannot activate the army to attack the army to its north and then move the corps to the south. That's not allowed. You can, however, if you choose combat, have differing targets. So for example, if that corps were in Naples, you could activate Rome for combat and have the army attack the army to its north and have the corps attack the corps to its south. Another thing with movement is if you ever have a non-moving army in a space you've activated for movement, you may attempt to dig a trench. So if you activate Rome for movement, you can go ahead and move the core to Naples or not, and then that army can attempt to dig a trench. It's very simple. You just roll a d6. If the result is equal to or less than the middle number, the loss factor, it's dug a trench successfully. And trenches look like this. And what trenches do in the game is they provide column shifts to benefit you, the holder of the trench, in battles. As you see, a level 1 trench moves offensive fire, that is fire into the hex where the trench is, 1 column to the left, which is bad for the attacker, of course, because the numbers are, as you see, smaller and weaker to the left. And your fire out of the space where the trench is moves 1 to the right, which is obviously good for you. And if you have no trench in the space, as we had in Rome a minute ago, if you dig, you would then place a level 1 trench in Rome, and these units benefit from the trench from now on. If you already have a level 1 trench and then you dig, you did upgrade it to level 2, which, as we see here, moves the offensive fire 2 column shifts to the left. That's doubly bad for the people attacking you in the trench. So trenches are important. You're going to want them on your fronts. They can be tricky to dig with weaker units, but they were important to the game. Also, I want to say a bit about activating multiple nations. If you have more than one nation in the same space, you must pay 1 op point per nation represented, even if you don't use the other forces for an activation. For example, if I wanted to move this British army north, even if I don't use the French army at all, I still have to pay 2 ops for that movement. And if I had 3 nations there, I must pay 3 ops to activate that square for anything to happen there. And 3 is the stacking limit in this game. You can't exceed 3 in any space, except temporarily through moving through a space. You can exceed it, but you can't end movement with more than 3 units in a space. So that's a bit about operations. That's how you conduct your moving and combat in the game. Let's go back to the card, though. That number to the right of the slash is called Strategic Redeployment, also known as SR. What that means is it allows you to move troops across the board very quickly across a long distance. So that gives you 4 SR points in this case. And armies cost 4 SR points to move, and corps cost 1 SR point each. So for example, if I wish to SR this German army in Metz to the Eastern Front, let's say I've got a gap in my line, I've got some trouble over here, I could use that card to SR him all the way over here to Czernowitz or Limburg or wherever I wish, if I have a clear supply line between the 2 points. That's the key. In this case, I do. So you can do that to move troops rapidly, quickly, across a long distance. And the same with corps. These corps can move to the Eastern Front at 1 movement point each. Corps may also SR between any 2 friendly controlled ports. So for example, this French court here in Marseille could SR down to this port in Naples. So if your land route is blocked, you may use friendly controlled ports as your points of SR. Again, that would cost 1 SR point to move that corps in that fashion. And you can also SR corps from the map to the reserve box. And why that's important is if you have no corps in your reserve box and you lose an army on the map, that army is out of the game forever. Normally, when you lose an army, it's going to come down to this replacement box, eliminated box, where you can replace it later with replacement points, which we'll cover in a few minutes. Now, that's SR. There are other rules, and the Near East map has several SR exceptions. I won't cover those again today in this video, but SR helps you move troops around the board rather quickly, as I've noted. Now, events in games like this do what they say. However, in this game, you see a number beside the event on certain cards, in parentheses. And what this does is when you play a card for the event with a number beside it, you increase your war status by that number. And war status is tracked here on the general records track. I have the Allies at 2, the CP at 3, and you see the combined that tracks both totals is 5. And you see boxes with LW on the number 4 box, and TW on the 11 box. Now here's what makes this game stand out to me in a very impressive way, is as you reach levels 4 and 11, you unlock your Limited War, LW, deck, and later your Total War, TW deck. And so, some TDGs have a shared deck where both players are pulling from the same deck. In this case, both powers have their own sets of decks. You begin with the mobilization deck. As you unlock the later decks, you add those to your hand, to the decks you're drawing from. As you might suspect, the cards get better and stronger as you advance, and so you want to get through these decks quickly, unlock them with war status, because they do make your deck stronger and more powerful. Now let's talk about these numbers at the bottom. These are called replacement points, RPs. So each nation there has a number you'll get when you play that card for RPs. RPs are not used immediately, but accrued throughout your turn. If you use more than one card for RPs, you track that over here on the general records track again. You see each nation has their own chit, and as you get more, you move them up. Now, between turns is when you use your RP points to rebuild your units. So it's not an instant ability, but you save them up and spend them between each turn. And because I know you're curious about what these mean, I'll show you briefly how RPs are used. I won't read this or go over it. You may wish to pause the video and look at that chart, but this is how you bring troops that have already been eliminated back into the game, or you can heal units on the map that are flipped and put them back to full strength status through RPs. But timing matters in this game, and you can't do certain things back to back. For example, you see SR and RP there in the third row. You cannot do those on consecutive activations. And so if I were to SR my first action of a turn, I couldn't do an SR with my second action. I have to do something else with the second action. Then I could do another SR with my third activation. You see also that you can't do more than one reinforcement event per nation per turn. Those are special events that bring more troops onto the board from the off-board supply. Here are some British reinforcements. You get an army and a corps. You see that event leaves the game. As I should have said earlier, asterisk events do leave the game when played. If you play TDGs, that's probably something you're already aware of. But if you play Guns of August for the event, it's out of the game. Same with this card here. So armies go to nations' capitals and or supply points. In this case, the British First Army would go in London, both the capital and supply point there. And corps from reinforcement cards go into the reserve box over here. And so you can only do one reinforcement event per nation per turn. You can do as many ops as you want and other events as you want, except for the top one, neutral entry events. One per turn, not per player. So this means you can bring in other countries into the war. Here's one for the Allies. This is Italy. And so if the Allied player brought Italy into the war as their first activation, the CP player could not bring in any neutral nations later that same turn. They have to wait till a future turn to do that. So this nation becomes activated, their units on the map are placed, and they're now eligible for movement, and now you can move and fight and operate in Italy. So here are the neutral nations the Allied player can bring into the war throughout the game. We've seen Italy already. They also have Greece and Romania available to them as they unlock those cards. And Romania has some special interactions with a CP event. If the CP player plays the Fall of the Tsar card, and Romania is still neutral in the game, they will get an extra 2 VPs if that's the case. And so there's a penalty at work if Romania is still not involved in the war when and if the CP player plays this card here. Now the CP side only has one neutral nation in their deck, and that is Bulgaria. However, Turkey joins the war on the CP side when the CP player reaches limited war, the war status 4 I showed you earlier. So there are 2 nations that can join the CP power side, Bulgaria and Turkey, and 3 joining the AP, Italy, Greece, and Romania. Let me talk a bit about forts and supply. So forts are these star-shaped spaces, and they have a number on the bottom. That's called their combat factor. And that would add to units that are there. So in this case, that would make the Serbian Second Army a 3. But forts don't need units. They can have some abstract units there to defend themselves. And so how do you deal with an opponent fort? Well, you can attack it from a neighboring space by activating that square. You can move onto it, and that would besiege it immediately. And once it's besieged, you may actually move through it. So if I had both these units here activated for movement, I can put the army on the fort. It's besieged, then the corps can actually go ahead and move through. Now you have to have an army to besiege a fort or a number of corps equal to the fort's combat factor. Now you can then attack it if you're on the space like this, but the reason you may not want to is because all besieged forts at the end of a turn have a siege roll. And so if you roll a d6 higher than the fort's combat number, the fort is destroyed, and you'd flip this over to show that fort is no longer there. So that obviously lets you destroy the fort without taking an activation, so it's kind of a free action between turns. If you wish to wait, you can attempt that roll. The forts range from 1 to 3. You see some stronger forts here on the Western Front. You have less odds of destroying, but those are the numbers on the forts, 1 through 3. Let me talk about supply for a moment. Supply is very important in this game. If you get cut out of supply, it's very detrimental to your troops. Supply points have this black and white circle in them. Their supply in Sofia for the Bulgarians. You see over here for the Germans, Essen on their Western Front. You see there in the top left, London for the British. You see the Germans have Breslau as well in the Eastern Front. You must always maintain a line of supply to your units, or they can be cut off and they can't react. And supply is very key. You can supply down into the Near East map as well through Constantinople here for the CP players. It goes through. It's kind of they have it two places, so you can see it's here as well as here, and that kind of connects those two parts of the map together. Oh, let me mention also, the CP player always takes the first activation around, and then the Allied. So it's CP first, back and forth through the 6. However, there's something that happens before each turn that is called a mandated offensive roll. And this d6 roll tells you which army must make an attack that turn. And this keeps the game fresh and interesting because you don't always want to attack with a particular army. You may not be set up well to do so. If you don't make the attack with that army on a turn, you will concede 1 VP to your opponent, which is a pretty big deal. You don't want to make the attacks when you can. So this forces you to make some decisions about when to make that attack, with whom, and where on the map to do so. There are rules around these, but I won't get into those for the purpose of the video. So let's go over here to the score track and talk a bit about that, and then we'll go to these national tracks up top. When the CP player scores VPs, the marker moves to the right, so the number increases. As the Allied player gains VPs, it goes to the lower numbers to the left. And so if the VP marker reaches 0, the Allied player wins the game. Conversely, if the VP marker reaches 20, the CP player wins the game. Now, normally it falls in the middle, and there are rules about what the score has to be for certain sides. I'll cover that at the end with one particular card especially. And so as you get points on the map, you move this up or down based on which side you are. There are some points in the cards and card effects that are pretty important as well, though not as many. Combined war status has an important effect for these tracks above, which is how Russia capitulates from the war as they did, and how the U.S. could enter the war as they did. And I'll say a bit about this. I won't belabor this because there's a little bit more to this than I'll show. The CP player must have at least, as you see when we get closer, at least 3 or more Russian VP spaces to allow the Tsar to take command. Now, there's a tracker for that here, the current CP, Russian VP. So once they've taken over 3 spaces, and there are 7 spaces in Russia that have points on the main map, and 1 in the Near East map, so actually there are 8 total possibilities. Once they have gotten 3, they can, the Tsar will take command of the army, and then that allows them to move the track forward. Once they have played the Tsar takes command card, they can then look to try to have the fall of the Tsar allowed, which is when the war status combined plus the current CP Russian VP equals 33 or more. So generally that would mean this comes down to 30 down here, and this would have to be at least at 3 or greater somewhere. You see also the word Zimmerman there in the combined war status of 30. What that means is the U.S. starts as neutral, and when 30 combined war status is reached, then the U.S. can begin their entry into the war. through playing this card called the Zimmerman Telegram. So there's the Zimmerman Telegram. Here's his R-Takes command. Now, astute watchers will notice and observe that these cards have a colored background behind the title of the event and the ops number. That's a helpful reminder that when you play these events, you may also use the card's ops as well. Only this edition has the colored backgrounds to remind you of that. You have to just know that in previous versions of the game. And so, why do both sides want to do this? Well, if the CP player fails to throw Russia, the Tsar, from his throne, then they will lose 2 VPs at the end of the game. Also, if the AP player does bring the U.S. troops into the game, they lose 1 point for every U.S. Army card not played as reinforcements, and there were 2 of those. So also 2 points at stake for both sides here on those counts. Further, if the CP player can push this all the way to the end and force Russia to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, then that's a good thing for them. Here's that card here. I'll show that to you. That changes the VP conditions. So if the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk card is not played, the CP player needs 13 or more points to win. If it is played, they only need 11 or more points to win. So in this example, if the treaty card has been played, then the CP player has won the game. If the treaty has not been played, they have lost the game. So it's to their advantage to get that out if they can. Of course, if you're up here in the 15, 16 range, you can still win the game without having the treaty card signed. That's a high-level view of this game. I haven't covered everything. The game lasts for 20 turns or until someone reaches an auto victory through 0 or 20. There are a couple of intro scenarios in the rulebook that are shorter. You can play more easily, kind of get your feet wet. They don't involve the Near East map as much, and so you can kind of learn the main board first, what I would advise you to do if you're new to the game. But I wanted to give a video that showed you a bit about the game, and if you're curious about this game, you can decide whether you think you would like it. Thanks for watching.